Just ahead on American Black Journal, has Detroit media coverage changed since the 1967 rebellion? Plus a debate on whether the events of that summer should be called a riot or a rebellion, and a community play focusing on the role of women and girls in the uprising. American Black Journal starts right now.
American Black Journal is funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a partner with communities where children come first.
How does diversity bring energy to us all? At DTE Energy, we believe that it's the contributions of all that build great communities. As a company, we grow stronger by welcoming the unique perspectives of everyone. As community members, we support our state's broad culture and heritage. From working closely with women and minority-owned suppliers to embracing our local cultures, DTE Energy is powering diversity. The DTE Energy Foundation is a proud sponsor of Detroit Public Television. Masco Corporation is proud to manufacture innovative and environmentally friendly products for the home. Delta faucets, craft-made in Merillat cabinets, and Behr brand paints have all been designed with you in mind. Masco and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929.
Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. As Detroit looks back at the 1967 rebellion, it's important to also focus on the media coverage then and now. Was it fair and was it accurate? What has changed 50 years later? While the fires were still smoldering in Detroit, President Lyndon Johnson appointed an 11-member panel that was later known as the Kerner Commission to investigate the causes of the uprising. They also addressed the impact of the news media on the disturbances. Later this month, the Detroit Historical Museum is hosting a panel discussion on the Commission's recommendations for the media. Joining me now is the event organizer, Karen Hudson Samuels from the wgpr-tv Historical Society. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Stephen, for having me.
Yeah, I find this an interesting, really interesting dimension of this, and it's something that most people are not really talking that much about as we get ready to commemorate the uprising, but in general, talk about the role that the media played in 1967 and why it showed up in the Kerner Commission as one of the issues that needed to be addressed.
Well, the reason it showed up because they devoted a whole chapter in the report to media and the disorder.
Yes.
And they used the term disorder, riot, and so forth throughout the report. And they came up with a series of findings and recommendations, and it had to do with the perspective from the reporters who covered the uprising or rebellion.
Yeah.
So they found that the accuracy of the media was dependent on a couple of variables. It was an emergency situation. They were, in some instances, relying on political officials for data. For example, in Detroit, officials said that $500 million worth of damage had been done. It was really 40 to 45 million. But they also found that the issue was really, there were issues that hadn't been addressed by the media. They didn't have African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanics. They didn't have a minority staff. Therefore, their coverage was from the perspective of a large part of their audience, which was white. But they also said, but you also have a black audience.
Right, right, and you're not serving them.
Covering them.
You know, at the same time, I can think of some really important sort of milestones that happened during that coverage in terms of diverse perspectives. Susan Watson, who goes on to be a wonderful columnist for the Detroit Free Press, one of my role models in the job that I do now, is a young reporter at the Free Press at the time that the rebellion happens. And my understanding, and I wasn't around, but is that she was able to get to some spaces and some stories that a lot of the other reporters were not able to.
And the Free Press is a standout in that regard in terms of having her on staff. The Kerner Commission report said there was a great underrepresentation in the ranks of the media. And they looked across all platforms, print, radio, and TV. And they said African Americans at that time had a lot of their news was coming from radio.
Right.
more so than newspapers,
Yes.
which was kind of interesting. So, and in the aftermath of the years following the uprising, there was greater hiring. So on the 29th, at our panel, we bring together journalists and community leaders to talk about, in our first panel, which we had on May 13th, we looked at the findings. What did they say? And then this time on the 29th, we're going to, what are the recommendations? They address what the police should do in their relationship to the media,
Yes.
hiring, recruitment, forming relationships in the community.
Yes. Yes.
A lot of different things, and so we want to talk about, well, what happened?
Yeah.
What happened?
Where are we now?
Where are we now?
What's your assessment of how much has changed in Detroit media in particular? How much better, let's say, I mean, God forbid, something like this would happen again in the city, how much better prepared would the media be to give a more accurate picture?
I might give a C-.
Yeah. It's not a very good grade.
No, well, it's barely passing. And I think there are two factors that come out in the Kerner Commission report that I would apply to your question. One is to the extent that at the time there were things rumbling in the community that the media didn't report or were unaware of.
Right.
Detroit was a model city. Well, we also had other things going on that were unaddressed. People might say that today. Are there things going on that are not fully addressed in the neighborhoods?
That people maybe in the media don't even understand.
Do we have relationships in the community? So that would be one factor. The other is hiring. And we know that people who appear on the air, on TV, are there to deliver and inform. They don't always make the decisions.
Sure.
Now, you are someone who has their own show, but if you're doing a news show, there are people behind the scenes.
Making the decisions about the content.
Exactly, and that coverage in terms of representation could be a lot better, although there are always new hires that come in, but it's really up to station management that sets the editorial perspective. And I think the stations do well, TV stations do well episodically in certain things, but
it's an issue that in most newsrooms have a fairly robust awareness of, I feel like, but then they come up short when the sort of action to deal with it is on the table. You know, I also wonder about how much media has itself changed over 50 years. I mean, primarily in 1967, you're talking about newspaper, radio, television. Now you have social media. You have lots of other media on the internet. If something like that were to happen now, that would really change the way it were portrayed as well.
It may and it may not. It's interesting. In the first series we did, we had an evaluation form. We asked people, how did you first hear about 1967? And what are your sources of news now, including social media and the frequency with which you use it? So clearly, people can look at their phone to get something immediate. That was one of the challenges and issues without knowing the community to be totally reactive, without totally understanding what's going on. You're responding to an event without the full knowledge of what, and it's really, that may be similar, and people have looked at Ferguson and other things that have happened in urban areas post 1967 and looking back and saying, well, how is this still happening? Are we ready, and what was the reporting there? So there's still opportunity for improvement.
Yeah, I mean, I also imagine, though, that we would have far more, I don't know how you would say it, primary source reporting of what was actually happening, if not from institutional media, from people standing around on the street with cell phones. I mean, think of the power that has given to the discussion about killings of African Americans by police, for instance. The fact that you can be places that you couldn't be 50 years ago.
That's true. You get to see the event in real time. You get to talk to the witnesses.
Draw your own conclusions.
And draw your own conclusions. It's probably, before it's led to that episode, that event, that incident, is their coverage of what is underlining. It's like an iceberg. We see the tip of the iceberg is the incident. The unseen part.
What's the rest of it?
What is the rest of it? And that's something that needs to be reported on an ongoing basis before there's a flashpoint.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for being here. We look forward to the panel.
It's free admission, July 29th, Saturday from 10 to 12. I hope people can come.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Most media outlets describe the turbulent summer of 1967 as rioting, but was it a riot or was it a rebellion? And how does our choice of words affect perceptions? I posed those questions to former Detroit Police Chief Ike McKinnon and Wayne State University professor Melba Boyd on the WDET radio show I host, Detroit Today.
So I pay very close attention to words, but I'm also, likewise, I'm a historian, and I've written on the 1967 rebellion, is what I call it. I think that language and also our connotative understanding of words changes over time, as you indicated earlier. And so when 67 occurred, we referred to it the way that the media referred to it, as a riot, and it was associated with a number of other uprisings that were occurring across the country over a period of time. I think beginning with this 1965 Watts rebellion. It was more than the idea and the use of the word riot. A riot tends to be a conflict between sets of people, sure, shall we say. So we had, for example, in 1943 in this city, we had a race riot. It was a actual physical confrontation and conflict between black people and white people in the city of Detroit.
Yes.
It's very different when you look at 1967 because that particular historical event was precipitated by severe police repression, yes, of black people and people of color in the city of Detroit. So that makes it a rebellion. That's what you're rebelling against the state. You're rebelling against.
Something very specific.
It's very specific in that sense. It's not just the idea of a riot indicates that you have black people just wilding out because they want to break in stores and take things and, be unruly and uncivil. And that's not the root cause of what instigated, in particular, that the rebellion.
Ike McKinnon, you were a police officer at that time, one of the few African-American officers on the force at
Yes.
that time. Talk about how you use words to describe the things that you saw and experienced during that uprising.
It's interesting for me because as a young police officer in the police academy in 1965, we were taught that anytime there was this kind of behavior, it was a riot. But the reality is that I don't think that, and I know that, most law enforcement people did not think about causes. And as Melba just said, we go back to 43, but let's go back, let's take in the 50s and what caused certain things to occur. I had witnessed as a young African-American male in Detroit, total brutality by law enforcement officers for years,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, to myself and my friends.
Right.
And there was no recourse for black people. I mean, if you went to the police station and you made a complaint, then you were arrested. These were things that happened. I mean, I was beaten up in 1957 by law enforcement officers. And so we get to 1967, and I recall specifically being out there, and I'm saying, man, these people are rioting. But I'm caught up in what was happening and what I went through in the police department, but not stopping to think about causes.
Yeah.
And I mean, I saw thousands of people doing things, but then as a young man who was shot at by my fellow officers who happened to be white because I was black.
Right.
And I'm saying, wait a minute, there's more to this. And it was an eye-opener for me. I must say that the rebellion of 1967 was truly an eye-opener for me to understand that police officers aren't going to be fair about this thing. And so the causal factors for what occurred and what happened to me just turned me around in terms of, man, there's got to be more to this than this. And it became an education for me, as Melba just said, that this is a rebellion against what was happening, the system of how people were treated, in particular, people of color in our country.
Yes.
And so there's no question, it's a rebellion.
Coming up next, a stage production focusing on the role of women and girls in the Detroit Rebellion. But first, here's a 1995 Detroit Black Journal interview about ethics in journalism.
I think journalism is gathering the news in an honest and fair and accurate manner. I think the people who go about the craft of doing journalism are people who have some integrity. I was reading somewhere that it has to start, the code of ethics has to start right here within the person. You can have all the writing you want in the news building, and you can tell people to follow what the newsroom says is ethics, but unless it starts here, you're not going to get it when you go out and you interview people and you write stories.
Here being in the internal or interpersonal integrity that an individual may or may not possess.
Right.
Desiree Cooper, editor-in-chief of the Metro Times, where there is no official board-registered guideline, test, or gauntlet that a journalist has to run year in, year out, no official form of review other than the court of public opinion and the editorial board's scrutiny, how can we ensure the integrity of a journalist's piece?
Well, I think in part you have to sort of trust a process. And I think I'd agree with Michelle's definition of journalism, but in addition to gathering information, journalism is very much about the process of then delivering, packaging, regurgitating information back to the public for its consumption. And the way journalism evolved in this country, we have to remember the idea was all ideas are good ones. Let them all surface and the public will decide what's good, what's bad, what they should believe and what they shouldn't.
A play that debuts this month tells the story of women and girls who participated in the 1967 Detroit Rebellion. The production is part of a commemorative event in the neighborhood where the uprising began, right at Rosa Parks Boulevard and Claremont. The play is called Afterlife, and it was conceived by my next guest, Dr. Lisa Biggs, assistant professor at Michigan State University. Joining her is one of the actresses in the play, Deborah Chenault Green. Welcome, both of you, to American Black Journal.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about this is, and I have to admit up front, in all of the things I have ever heard about the 1967 rebellion, all the discussions, all the debate, I have never heard someone talk about the role that women played, almost as if they didn't play any role, almost as if they didn't exist in the incident. And so obviously your play is not just timely, it's important in that it's filling in a gap of knowledge that I think is probably pretty widespread.
It's my hope. One of the things that kind of drew me to the topic is when I moved to MSU in the fall of 2013 from Chicago, I wanted to learn about the history of the state, and I was immediately struck by the fact that the anniversary of the rebellion was coming up. Mm-hmm. But as I was reading, archives of the Free Press and the Michigan Chronicle and the histories, I noticed that women were not mentioned. Women, right? That they're certainly pictured alongside men time and time again. So I decided, to just start asking these questions about, where were the women and the girls? Yeah. And luckily, there are some published oral histories. The Detroit Historical Society has been engaged in this effort, and there's been many, many books coming out of Wayne State University and other presses that are dedicated to the topic. And all I think I've tried to do is really put a lens on women and girls' experiences, with the hope that if we understand kind of the full scope and scale of the circumstances that led to the rebellion, the harms that were done, that we might be able to look upon the past more clearly, and then as we think about today, really be able to figure out ways of addressing any long-standing, long-term problems that include their voices. Yes.
It's not a surprising fact that women played a pivotal role in the rebellion, not just as victims in some cases of the things that went on, but as organizers, right? I mean, they were in the lead in many cases.
They got arrested right along with the men.
Right.
They constituted 10 to 12% of all the people that were held, so about 800 women and girls got arrested because they were out there. And on the other side of the coin, there's many stories about National Guardsmen being deployed, and the Guard did not prepare for them to have food or water. Women in neighborhoods went out with lemonade and sandwiches to try and de-escalate some of the tension that was going on. And certainly they snatched up their kids when they were, out there, or in order to prevent them from going out.
Right.
And then you saw women, of course, immediately do things like put the word out through church networks that there are places like Grace Episcopal Church, which is right at the corner of 12th and Euclid, that their church was a place where people could get food, water, and information. They prompted the male leaders who the city was used to seeing as spokespersons to address issues in ways that included women and girls' needs. So they were pivotal, even if the history books have not done the best job of recognizing their contributions.
So talk about the role that you play in the production here.
Well, I'm one of 9 actors, and my concern has to do with me actually growing up in the area. When the rebellion broke out, I was actually on Hazelwood and 14th at my aunt's house. My mom, we were preparing for my mom's birthday party later on that evening. And my cousin and I, because it was so hot, we had pulled the mattress out on the porch. And we were laying there asleep, and we heard the noise. It woke us up. So we rushed and got them, and we started to see the smoke and the fire and what have you. Later on, my mom came and got me and took me back to where I lived, which was on 12th Street and Highland. And we could actually see what was going on from our window because we were in a 2-story walk-up. And so we saw the tanks, and we saw the looting, and we saw the people getting arrested, and we actually learned how to hit the floor when we heard gunfire, and spent a lot of time on the floor some nights because of that. So I'm bringing my poetry, my experiences to this production. And
talk about how that feels after such a long period of time and people not really paying attention to those stories or asking to hear them.
It was actually a pleasure for me when Lisa asked me to use a couple of my pieces in the production when I wrote them. It brings back so many memories when you go back and revisit that time. For a child of 12 years old, that was a very scary time. And you talk about what the women were doing. I can remember the women making sure there was some sort of normalcy still maintained in the families, making sure everything was okay with the families.
Sort of the role that women play all the time,
right?
Absolutely.
I can remember my church members being in prayer with New Bethel, Aretha Franklin Father's church, every night, and going up there, making sure they were back before curfew time, So I can remember those roles of those women and basically making sure they kept their children close. We could go out and play, but we couldn't go far. We had to be, where they could see us to make sure we were okay and to assure us that we were going to be okay.
I mean, what a powerful gift to be able to give voice to this story and the others, right?
I am humbled. I'm truly humbled that the members of the Virginia Park community have embraced the project in the ways that they have. I never intended it for it to be like a little thing that happens at MSU. And then, I always hoped that we would start working at it at MSU with my students who are Michigan natives. And many of them had never heard any of these stories. But the goal was always to share the little bit that we were able to create at State with the community and then build upon it in myriad, deep and profound ways. So the majority of the cast are Detroit natives. There are a few people from out of town, that happens, but the focus is on listening and creating really a space in which people can tell their own stories.
What are you hearing, I'm curious, what did you hear from your students about this work? What was their reaction to learning about all of this?
Well, many of them had heard the inaccurate story that it was just a bunch of crazy black people and that
lost their minds and burned the city down.
Why did black people burn their own homes? And so what I did was really try and unpack that, and through theater they get a greater sense of the felt history, the living history, the experience. I mean, of course we can never go back in time, but now that they have played or are playing people who lost businesses, who lost loved ones, who had to go to funerals, had to plan plan funerals. We're at the Fox Theater, you know, having a good time, and then you hear Martha and the Vandellas come on stage and say, you got to go, you know, you got to get home, no way to get home, having to run through the streets, have rifles put in their faces. You know, they have a much sense of the immediacy, but also some of the ties between the past and the present are much more alive for them now.
And before we end, the times that people can go see the
So last 2 weekends of July, the 20th, 21st, and 22nd, 27th, and 28th at the Joseph Walker Williams Recreation Center.
Also a wonderful place in that community.
Yes.
Great center.
Absolutely.
Congratulations on the work, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
That's our program for today. Be sure to join us next Sunday, July 23rd, for a special hour-long show on the 50th anniversary of the Detroit Rebellion from the neighborhood where it all started. For more information about today's guests, you can visit AmericanBlackJournal.org. And as always, you can connect with us on Facebook and on Twitter. We'll see you next time.
American Black Journal is funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a partner with communities where children come first.
How does diversity bring energy to us all? At DTE Energy, we believe that it's the contributions of all that build great communities. As a company, we grow stronger by welcoming the unique perspectives of everyone. As community members, we support our state's broad culture and heritage. From working closely with women and minority-owned suppliers to embracing our local cultures, DTE Energy is powering diversity. The DTE Energy Foundation is a proud sponsor of Detroit Public Television. Masco Corporation is proud to manufacture innovative and environmentally friendly products for the home. Delta faucets, craft-made in Merillat cabinets, and Behr brand paints have all been designed with you in mind. Masco and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929.